Hey everybody! And a warm welcome to a new story. Today's story is called Entitled Stepmother Wears White to a Wedding to Get Revenge on My Dying Grandmother. From the Entitled Parents subreddit. I hope you like it and will enjoy the time. If you like my content and this kind of videos, please leave a comment and subscribe to my channel. As always, this story is told from the OP's point of view. Enjoy it. Now, my stepmother and I have a long-running history going on 14 years now. She came into my life when I was very young, and she's been tormenting it since. I have tons and tons of stories about her, but this one will give a brief history of her antics. The backstory is a chunk of it, but very important to the event in the title. My stepmother is not liked by my father's side of the family for many reasons. 1. She didn't treat my sister, father, or I very well, and 2. She drove my father into debt with her high shopping sprees. My stepmother also has 2 children, a daughter who is a little over 11 years older than me, I'm 20, and a son who is 3 years younger than me. My grandmother lived across the street from where my sister and I grew up. She helped my dad out a lot after my mom left, and she watched over the two of us like hawks. I think she had an intuition about my stepmother because she didn't like her very much from the start. It came to a boil one day about a month before her and my dad got married. My grandfather had just passed away and one of my older cousins was outside doing yard work for my grandmother. My grandfather had a little playground put in for my sister and I, but we had gone to see our mother for the weekend, so my stepmother took my stepbrother over there. It was all nice and dandy until my stepbrother started taunting my cousin, saying, "Your grandpa died. Your grandpa died." We had just been to the funeral the week beforehand, so the wound was still pretty open for all of us. My cousin told my stepmother to tell him to stop, but she just kind of stuck up her nose and said that he was fine and he was just being a kid. Side note, my stepbrother is now 18 and super entitled. My cousin was very upset, so he went up to the house and told my grandmother. My grandmother was a tough woman when it came to my stepmother and defending her grandchildren. She marched down to the playground and asked my stepmother to leave as she wasn't welcome on her property if she was going to allow her son to speak in the manner that he was. My stepmother retaliated and called my grandmother a bitch. My grandmother swore back at her and it led up to my stepmother following her up the driveway and my grandmother throwing a doormat at her. There was always tension around the holidays after that, and my grandmother's hate for my stepmother grew throughout the years as she learned about how we were being verbally abused. She suggested to my father many times that he needed to get a divorce for the sake of my sister and I, but he didn't. My grandmother became sick about 4 years after they got married. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and while she did go into remission, it did come back. My cousin was living with my grandmother when she was diagnosed and they had a very close bond with one another. My cousin got engaged a little over a year and a half before my grandmother passed. They found out that her cancer had returned not long before his wedding and she was super sickly. So we knew that this may have been the last big family event we were all going to have together, and it was sadly. My cousin and his wife chose my sister and I for flower girls. So we were a part of the wedding, and due to that, we didn't arrive with our parents. We didn't see much of them at all before the wedding because we had to get our hair done along with the rest of the party. At the church, my sister and I were standing outside the chapel talking with my cousin when I saw him make a face. My stepmother, father, and stepbrother had just walked in the door and my stepmother was wearing white. Now, my cousin's wife had been a part of the family for long enough to know about my stepmother's antics. And if it wasn't for the fact that she was getting ready for her wedding, she would have thrown my stepmother out then and there. My cousin didn't want to cause any trouble on the big day though, so he let it slide, but I know my dad caught the look that he gave him. The wedding goes fine, and before the reception, we were all taking photos. Everyone knew at this point of my stepmother's attire as she was standing at the doors of the chapel smirking during photos. She attempted to butt into, but wasn't considered a part of the immediate family or wedding party. And if the looks that everyone was giving her could kill, she'd have been dead. My grandmother had dressed her best that day despite her illness, and she hung onto my cousin's arm during their photo before I heard her mumble, "I'll be damned if she wears white to another wedding," with that grin on her face. Again, my grandmother was tough. This is anticlimactic, but no fights broke out, no one yelled at anyone. The only thing that did happen is that my cousin had a long talk with my father about his wife. About how this was a family event and she knew that what she wore was extremely frowned upon. She did try to butt into every conversation during the reception, and her son acted like a total dickhead the whole time, but that was expected. Her actions though spoke loudly about her character, as we all knew that my grandmother wasn't doing well. My sister and I were still super young, so we knew that she wasn't going to be seeing her other 2 grandchildren get married. She knew that this was going to be one of the last few times the family got together in celebration of something, and my stepmother had to step all over it and draw attention to herself. My grandmother passed away that November, the wedding was in June. When my grandmother went into hospice, my stepmother booed and hooed like she actually cared. But she kept talking about her own mother's battle with cancer, trying to compare the two as if they had some sort of resemblance. But the illness was the only thing comparable. My stepmother thought she had something left for her in the will, but she was definitely wrong about that. She didn't act up at the funeral, but she did during Christmas, which was the toughest holiday for all of the family as we spent it at my grandmother's house. And it was the first time she wasn't there to be with us. My grandmother had picked out specific things relating to her for the 4 grandchildren and my cousins' wives when she went into hospice. My stepbrother didn't get anything from my grandmother that year, and my stepmother threw a fit, storming out of the house and going home even though the gifts we were given were sentimental to the connection we had with our grandmother. It's been 8 years and she still won't get over the fact that my grandmother didn't give him a gift that Christmas, or maybe it's because she didn't get anything in the will. Though she had in the past. She still hangs it over our faces sometimes. Her own father is a very old man now, but ever since my grandmother's passing, she's told my sister and I, "Your grandmother didn't give me, stepbrother, and stepsister anything when she died, so my dad won't give you and sister anything. It's only fair." I can't stand her. My grandmother must be rolling around in her grave if she's seen half the shit my stepmother has done since then. Edit: I had a couple things to add since I fell asleep after posting this and I've seen a lot of questions. Wearing white to a wedding is a cultural thing. Only the bride is supposed to be dressed in white as it's her big day, and if someone else wears white, it shows that they're trying to upstage the bride and take the attention away from her. That was my stepmother's intention with that situation. Second off, I'm gonna address my father. He has a certain choice in women. My mother would probably fit into another handful of stories all of its own, as she's very much similar to my stepmother. I did mention that my mother left in this story, and what I mean by that is she walked out suddenly when I was 4. This affected my dad greatly as he was left with 2 children and didn't know what to do with suddenly being abandoned. He met my stepmother about a year or so later, and after finally getting my mother to court about their divorce, he married my stepmother 6 months later. As I said, she's been in my life for 14 years now. So, why hasn't my father left? Simply because he's afraid of being alone after what my mother did to him. I was a hellion to my stepmother when I was younger for good reasoning, and he looked at me one day and asked me if I wanted him to be alone. He's realized in the past 2 years that she's shoving his daughters away. I walked out after her and I got into a fight, and she threatened to call the cops on me because I shoved her when I didn't, and my father knows I didn't because I was standing right there. My sister is turning 18 in a couple of months, so she's planning on leaving herself. Where she goes hasn't been decided yet. But she's talked about moving in with my boyfriend and I over an hour away. I moved that far to have an excuse to not be around often. I said in another comment that my sister and I are making bets on when they'll divorce after she leaves. My stepmother has drained my father over the years money-wise, and health-wise. He busts his ass working 60 hours a week and volunteers to work on Saturdays just to be away from her. The only reason he tolerates her on Sundays is because she's recently decided to start getting drunk on those days. He looks 20 years older than he actually is now, and it's rough to look at. So yeah, some of you have said my dad seems spineless, and in a way he is. I'm not upset with her being around so long though, because I know he has his reasons and fears, and it's FKED up. But those same fears have been instilled on me from a young age from him and from what my mom did to us. What do you think about this story? Tell me your thought in the comments. If you like the story and the content, please leave a like, subscribe and share this video. Also have a look into my playlist for more entertaining stories.